Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the UIKit Facebook 2019 tutorial series on the Let's Build That App.com channel. I hope you guys are having a marvelous afternoon out there in the real world. Today's video, we are going to continue on with episode 3 of the entire series. So if you missed episode 1 or episode 2, you can find the links to the playlist down in the descriptions below. Okay, all that being said, let's kind of hop back into the simulator on the right side over here. And let's kind of talk about what we want to build out for today's episode, right? You see, currently we have this entire list that we can scroll up and down. Last episode, I showed you guys the photos grid right here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 photos. And today's lesson, I want to move on and talk about this header at the very top here. Whenever I say header, I'm pretty much referring to the view object that is on top of our entire list here. So here's our list. And at the very top, we have our header object. Now, if you want to be technically correct, the header is currently containing the what's your mind text right here, as well as the live photo and check-in buttons. But there's a lot going on, so I just want to show you how to build out this horizontal list first, and then we'll take care of this scrolly behavior maybe in the next episode. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin by going back into our Xcode project here. Currently, I am opened in my main controller file, and we have these 2 cells, so actually 4 cells here. And last episode, I showed you guys the photos grid controller, which is right here. And to make today's episode a little bit faster and easier to record, I'm just going to be editing the main controller file directly. And the first thing I'm going to do is to start adding a header onto my controller, my list controller, which is this class on line 36. And one thing that you have to realize about the LBTA tools framework or library is that the list controller is actually a subclass of something else called a list header controller. So this guy. And previously, the list controller that I showed you, it currently takes in 2 generics, right? The actual cell that it wants to render and the item per cell. And for a header controller, you can actually do something very similar. So you can say post cell, give it the generic for the cell, and then the third generic is the actual header object. So some kind of header like that. This guy, we don't really have a header class defined yet. So I'm going to define a header right now. So let's say class, and let's call this guy a story header. For collection views, you have to use a UI collection reusable view for a header. And this is, let's see, let's override the initializer with super init and frame and pass in frame. You have to also provide the required, otherwise the compiler will kind of yell at you. Okay, now with the story header, what I can do is I can replace the list controller with the list header controller, give it the generic of story header right here. And you don't really need this anymore. It's pretty much this guy below. And with the story header, right, what do we want to do with it, and how exactly do we show this inside of the controller over here? You can see if you restart, everything looks just like it did before. The way I'm going to show this story header is to give it a background color. And background color, let's pick the color of yellow for today. I feel like yellow is a lucky color. And finally, for the story header, for these collection view controllers, which is what this guy is, you can now say, see ref size header and return the init of some kind of value. Let's use 0 and 200. I feel like it ignores the value of 0 right here. So you don't really have to care too much about this value. Just make sure that the height is all right. And now you'll get your yellow story header in the yellow right there. So pretty easy stuff. You'll notice that inside of the completed version of the app, right, there's actually a gap between the header up here. So here's a gray gap. And the way you provide this gap is pretty simple. You want to say inset for section at, return some kind of value. Let's say 12000, and let's hit Command Option P. You'll now see that the header has a inset at the top because obviously we provided the value right here of 12. Okay, so hopefully everything up to this point is making sense so far. Let's go ahead and talk about how to render out this horizontal list of these 3 cells. So here's 1, 2, and 3. And how exactly do we want to render that out? Well, you can provide your own horizontal collection view inside of the story header itself and add it into its subview hierarchy. That's a possibility, but that requires a lot of typing. Instead of doing that, I'm going to provide some kind of stories controller subclass. And this is going to subclass the list controller with a T and U, just like we did before. And the way I'm going to make use of stories controller is this right here. I'm going to give this a cell class to replace the T right here. I am going to call this the story cell, or maybe a story photo cell. And this guy will be a list cell, takes in a generic of string like that. And just to make things easier to see, I'm going to override the setViews method for all of your cells. And let's say background color equals dot red. That's a color that I'm not using yet, so that's kind of why I'm using red. For the stories controller, I'm going to use the stories cell, and make sure to use whatever you're providing for the story cell as the U generic here. And now things should start showing up correctly. Let's override superview to load here and say self.items equals some kind of array of objects. Let's say avatar1. And why don't we provide another one like that? Let me hit Command Option P to resume. And we should start being able to, let's see, render out this guy somehow. You see, we only have the yellow header right here, right? So instead of seeing the yellow, I'm going to go ahead and add in the stories controller, which is going to be 2 cells right now that are red. So let me show you how that works by saying let an instance of stories controller. So stories controller equals that right there. And for the stories controller, or more technically correct, any subclass of list controller right here, it has a constructor that comes with this scroll direction there. So let's make use of that. I'm going to make my scroll direction horizontal because, well, obviously this guy goes horizontally left and right. So stories controller now, I'm going to say this. So I'm going to say stack of stories controller.view, and let's try to resume this right now to see exactly what we'll be rendering out. Okay, so a lot of typing, but this right here allows us to render out 2 cells inside of our header because we're stacking the stories controller, which contains 2 red cells here. And the reason why it's showing up like this is because by default, when you make your UI collection view controller horizontal, it's going to stack things up and down. The reason for that is because we haven't provided a size for our cells yet. So let me just fix this by giving the, let's see, stories controller is rendering out our 2 red cells here. I am going to say UI collection delegate flow layout. And then finally, let's say size for item for each one of our red cells here. I am going to return the, let's see, init of some kind of value. Let's say 100 and 200. And I'll hit resume up there. We are going to see now everything should be rendering out in a horizontal collection view because everything is now being able to encompass the entire height with this 200 value here. Something else that you can use instead of this 200 is the view frame.height. This is actually a little bit better, so I'm going to use that instead. And if you resume, everything looks pretty much the same there. Now, right here, you can actually take the avatar one and duplicate this a couple of times. And every time you introduce a new element inside of your items array for your controller, it's just going to introduce a new object inside of your collection view. So, using list controller makes your job of rendering out these types of applications pretty simple once you kind of understand the workflow here. Okay, last thing I'll probably show you before I let you go is how exactly do we render out these images, right? Well, this is pretty easy. The red cells right here, the story photo cell, all we have to do now is to create some kind of image view. And then let's see, image view with this, and this comes with a content mode. So let's say scale aspect fill. just to make sure that things are showing up correctly in terms of the aspect ratio, I am going to just simply stack this image view inside of the entire cell here. And then because we are using list controller, the cell will be passed each one of these items through the item property here. So whenever that is being set, I'm going to say image view equals UI image. And let's say named of the item right here, I'm going to hit resume. And hopefully this will run, but I don't have my properties matching just yet. So what you'll see now is each of your cells, the previously red cells, right? The red cells, story cells, they are now rendering out the entire image inside of it like that. If you want to make your images round on the edges, somewhere right here, the edges are kind of round. You can say image view.layer.corner radius equals something like 5, and you are going to see some changes here. Let's remove the red here. And that is kind of looking okay. You can't really see it. So here's what I'll do. Inside of my assets, I have this photo right here called photo 1. So photo 1 looks like that. I am going to go inside of main controller again. For the very first one, I'm going to say photo 1, hit Command Option P to resume. It should now resume and start redrawing the actual header at the very top here. And you'll see a small amount of corner radius. You can obviously change this to be something like 10. It'll look like that instead. Obviously, play around with these values until you're happy. The last thing I will talk about here is you see how we have the gaps on the left edge here, the top edge here, and maybe on the right edge there might be a gap. Well, how exactly do we provide these gap values, right? Well, this is very easy, and the first thing I'll address is the actual gaps on the top and bottom here. If you look at your stories controller, which is your horizontal controller of cells here, so this is a horizontal controllers right here, horizontal cells, they're given this height right here, and if I just subtract 24 from each of the cell heights, you'll see that it'll just take 12 from the top and 12 from the bottom. So a pretty easy solution to make this work correctly. Something that you can do to provide left padding is to do this here. So inset for section at return the value of 0, 12, 0, and 12. And with this change here, you'll notice that the stories controller is going to start with some inset padding on the left edge here. And because we provided the right edge of 12, you're going to see a right padding of 12 as well. Okay, so this is looking a lot better. I think I might have these other photos that I might be able to use as story photo 1 and then story photo 2. I just want to see that these photos are being rendered out correctly. And let's see, these photos are indeed looking quite nice. Let's see, we are looking pretty finished so far. And let's see, we are doing okay on time. One thing that I might want to show you for today's lesson is how exactly do we render out this gradient at the very bottom, somewhere right here. So you see there's a name label on top of a gradient. Let's talk about the label first, and then maybe we'll draw out the dark gradient. So I'm going to go back to my stories cell right here. It contains my image view. So these images right here. I am going to draw a label, let name label equals UI label. And let's see, text. This comes from LBTA tools, makes my life a lot easier. This is a K-pop, or I guess a Korean star called Lee Jin. And that is her name. That is the label. Let's see, how do I want to place this inside of this cell right here? Well, what you can do is you can call stack and stack the name label. Let's see what that does. It should start showing up somewhere at the very middle right here because labels have their actual text centered vertically. So that's why that looks like that. If you want to change the text color of the label, you can say text color of .white, and this should change right now. So right now that looks white. If you want to change the font, you can say font of, let's see, bold system font of, let's say 14. And maybe that will look a little bit better, but you'll kind of see that it's still very non-legible, especially if it's on top of a white image like this one right here, and also this one on the second slot. So the next thing I'll do is I would maybe want to place the labels at the very bottom of these cells instead of the middle, right? And how exactly do we do that? Well, there's a lot of tricks to this actual layout problem. And I find one of the easiest ways is to maybe just introduce a stacking of a UI view on top of the name label. And just by default, this view right here will take all of the remaining space at the very top and pushing the label all the way at the very bottom. So that's a neat trick, and I am happy with that trick, so I'm just going to leave it there. I might want to introduce some margins for the actual stack view. So you can say init with this value, or maybe with the all edges. This guy is a little bit easier to use, so I'm just going to use all sides of 8, and pretty much gives this 8 on all edges right here. Okay, now it's looking a lot nicer, and we still have this problem where if the name label is stacked on top of a white image, it's really hard to read. So the way to fix this user experience problem is to introduce this gradient at the very bottom. And obviously it looks a lot better, right? You can actually read the freaking text. So the question is, how do we render out this gradient nicely? Well, because I've done this like at least 100 times for all of the apps that I've built out, I remember how to type out the code. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to set up some kind of gradient inside of my photo cell. You might be asking, how exactly do you do this? Well, I am going to go in between the image view and then the labels right here. I am going to say set up gradient layer, and this is a special method. Let's see, file private function. Let's set up a gradient layer here. What exactly is a gradient layer? Some of you guys might be asking. Well, you know, it's a pretty easy concept to understand once you see the code. It's basically a gradient layer of type core animation gradient layer. And this guy has two very, very useful properties on it called colors and also locations. So what exactly is colors? Well, you just need to provide two different colors. And I always like to start with the black color and CG color. Make sure to use CG color, otherwise this doesn't work. I'm going to now give this the value of UI color.red.cg color. I'm going to modify this to be the clear color in just a bit, but using black and red makes this a lot easier to read. And then finally, I'm going to give the locations the value of 0 and 1. And this looks pretty good. I'm finally going to say layer.add sublayer gradient layer. And this is pretty much all I need. So I'm going to hit Command Option P to resume. You're not going to see the actual gradient at all. Let's try again here. And we are okay. We have our name label at the very bottom. All right. Now this gradient layer, the reason why you're not seeing it is because you actually need to provide a frame for these layer components. And when you're setting up these cells, right, we're using auto layout to place a lot of these elements inside of here. We are stacking this image view on the left, trailing top and bottom. Same thing for the name label. It's actually being placed using the stack view. That's kind of why it's appearing at the very bottom. And the whole issue with the placing of frames inside of iOS is that sometimes you don't have access to the frames. So one thing that you can do is you can actually override this thing called layout subviews inside of your cells, and make sure to also call super layout subviews. And inside of here, you have access to how large the entire cell is. So the cell is like 100 by 200 at this point in time. And I'm going to make use of that little bit of information. And during the layout subviews, I'm going to modify my gradient layer. So I have to move it outside of this actual function scope. This way I can actually access it in this scope here. So what exactly am I going to do? I'm going to say gradient layer dot frame equals bounds. I hope that's the correct one. It might be flipped around. So this looks okay. And here is the entire trick for actually laying out your gradient. You just need to make sure that your frame on your gradient layer is some correct value. We have 0 and 1 from black to red. You can modify this to be 0.5. It'll take the gradient from the first color right here all the way down to 0.5 of the entire frame. Okay, so hopefully that's a decent explanation. You really have to play around with this code a couple of times before you really understand it, but you know, that's the general idea. Last thing I will do is to give this guy the black color and give this the clear color. Okay, hopefully that will start looking quite nice. And you see the gradient is now showing up at the very bottom. You can actually modify this to be bigger, greater than 1, not bigger than 1, but greater than 1 at 1.2, and maybe this value, give it a 0.7. You know, play with it until you're happy, maybe 1.1 here. Okay, you'll see that the corner edge right here is not rounded. You can say layer dot corner radius equals to whatever value you put up here, and you should be fine. This doesn't look like it's working, so let me say gradient layer. Let's just say gradient layer here, or maybe clips to bounds equals to true. I think that works as well. Okay, so that is looking quite nice. You might want to add this little circle image at the very top left. Hopefully you guys can do that on your own, but maybe I'll include that in the source code down in the links below. If you want to download the source code for the entire lesson in today's video, make sure to head on over to letsbuildthatapp.com. You can find the available source code right over here on the right side. And while you're here, check out the rest of the available courses on the website. Again, brand new course with maps, with direction and Google Places. A really, really amazing course, and hopefully I can see you in the very first lesson there. That's gonna be it for today's video. Make sure to leave a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Bye-bye, guys.